Welcome, everybody. We are back talking about James Corbett's 9/11 suspects. A couple weeks ago, we did just an excerpt of that. We focused on the dancing Israelis concept, which was the last 20 minutes or so of this documentary, which is linked in the description. If you didn't have a chance to watch it, it may not be as helpful to discuss today. But hopefully, if you haven't watched it, I can encourage you to watch it. It's well worth your time. The suspects, other than the dancing Israelis that James Corbett talks about, are Rudy Giuliani, Christine Todd Whitman, Philip Zelikow, Bob Bayer, and Ralph Eberhart. Now, the premise that Corbett starts us with is that 9/11 was a crime. Therefore, it should be investigated like a crime. And I think that's a very reasonable idea. And he starts, I think, with the person who has joined himself at the hip to 9/11, so much so that he's made it a brand in this disgusting way, and that's Rudy Giuliani. And we've had plenty of time to know more about how horrible he is in the years since 9/11. But he was put forward at the time as America's mayor, and there are a number of really interesting questions that Corbett asks that are worth asking. One, why was all the metal hauled away before being tested forensically? They were sold at a cut rate to China. Human remains were there. There was no regard for any of this. He simply just moved the metal away. And some might argue, well, it's an emergency and we had to do this. All right. But there's no accountability. There's no sense of setting aside some of it so that some of it could be investigated, because later on we would find out that people who were able to get access to some of those materials were able to test it and were able to find out the existence of thermite, etc. Building 7 held the bunker for Giuliani, specifically for an event like this, not necessarily an event in which buildings above Building 7 had been hit, but an emergency for the city of New York. There was a bunker with its own water supply, its own power supply, was reinforced. Nobody was there. Giuliani wasn't there. In part, I'm sure, because he was told or he knew that Building 7 was going to come down. So why would he hold himself up in that building? He managed to go to Pier 92, which coincidentally, of course, coincidence always, coincidentally was already staged for an exercise on September the 12th. An exercise about some sort of disaster happening to New York. So this coincides with what we'd see with NORAD and with other agencies coordinating plannings of disasters, such that we have that famous audio from 9/11. Is this real world or exercise? Because the idea was, well, we've had exercises like this before. That's why I would ask it. Not that this is so crazy. I've never heard of this before. That's why he said, is it real world or exercise? So why doesn't he go to Building 7? Why did he haul away all the evidence? Why was Pier 92 already staffed, ready for an emergency? These are all great questions. And again, Corbett is not trying to forensically go into each suspect. He's saying these people are suspicious for these various reasons. Why don't we ask them further? And of course, it's almost rhetorical, because who's going to ask these people? The US government wasn't interested in investigating itself. Remember, it took more than a year to get a 9/11 commission report going. And when that commission was put together, it was understaffed. The first person that was put in charge of it was Henry Kissinger. And he was forced to step down by 9/11 families asking him about his connections to the House of Saud. And you have to hand kudos to these widows, these family members who knew enough. They didn't necessarily know who Henry Kissinger was, but they thought, okay, if someone's going to look into the deaths of my family, I'd like to know more about them. They went on the internet, even in 2003, 2004, or they did their research and they found out, oh, Kissinger's a war criminal. And he's interested in helping cover up war crimes. And of course, he would be the perfect person to help put together a Warren Commission type report, which exonerates the government and said somebody else's fault. It's not our fault. Don't know what we could have done about it. The second person talked about is Christine Todd Whitman. Christine Todd Whitman is, I would say, the person most responsible for the deaths and diseases of many 9/11 first responders, in part because she was in charge of the agency, the EPA, who would have cleared people to go back to ground zero. Now, as one of the people testified, people were going back there without permission. They thought people are under the rubble. We're going to try and rescue people out from under the rubble. They weren't calling the government and saying, is it safe to go back? They just acted instinctively. Okay, so I'm not trying to blame Christine Todd Whitman for the actions of these heroic people who were simply trying to rescue fellow human beings and didn't really know what was going on in the air. But as head of the EPA, she stated on the record there was no serious concentration of dangerous chemicals. You just had two skyscrapers come down, both of them filled with asbestos because they were built in an earlier era in which there was asbestos all over the building. All the other stuff that was in there, all throughout, the levels were off the charts, but we couldn't, as America, let anyone think that anything was wrong. We had to be back to business. We had to have the optics of going back to business. So everybody go back to ground zero. Don't worry about masks. They advised against respirators for the ground zero workers. Later on, they issued advice for their own staff to wear respirators. Classic example. We saw this during COVID. You're not allowed to do this. However, we're going to do this. We saw this in the UK. You're not allowed to have parties, but we're going to have the biggest Christmas party ever. We have the governor of California saying, you can't have parties. In the meantime, I'm going to go have parties with my friends and we're not going to wear masks. So Christine Todd Whitman, no serious concentration of dangerous chemicals, which led to numerous firefighters, first responders, police who were down there for months and months and months, breathing in these dangerous chemicals, developing cancers and dying with no justice done for them. And they're largely ignored even to this day. We have Philip Zelikow. Now, Philip Zelikow is a bit more of a shady character because he stands behind some of these front people. So Christine Todd Whitman in front of the cameras, Rudy Giuliani in front of the cameras. In fact, you might even say they love the cameras. Some of these people a little further behind the scenes. Philip Zelikow, one of these eggheads that worked at state and other places developing policy. And Corbett asked the question, how could Zelikow be seriously asked to investigate the failures of the Bush administration? Is that serious? Especially because it's known, although Zelikow would deny it, I've heard that he would deny parts of it, not all of it. But he's responsible for the national security strategy. It was about 20, 30 pages, which enunciates the Bush doctrine of preemptive war. And later on in 2002, I think it's September 2002 at the University of Virginia, he would go on to enunciate, well, why preemptive war in the Middle East? Well, because of threats against Israel. Because we know that that's the reason to do anything in the Middle East, right? Because poor Israel is going to get hurt. He also was responsible for covering up the findings of Able Danger. If you're unfamiliar with Able Danger, this was headed up by Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer. He has been on the record numerous times that by September of 2000, he and his team had identified Able Danger was a counterterrorism organization, and that they had identified 2 of the 3 cells that operated on 9/11. One of them was Mohammed Atta. They communicated this to the FBI, and the FBI said, we can't pursue this any further for various reasons. You could look it up. There's lots of stuff on Able Danger on the internet, a lot of it cover up stuff. But the idea is Zelikow was part of making sure that the 9/11 Commission couldn't do its job. He would obfuscate, he would hide stuff. He covered up Able Danger such that Able Danger was then said, oh, no, it was said in the official commission report, oh, yes, Able Danger didn't actually identify, even though Colonel Schaefer is on the record of saying, yes, we identified 2 of the 3 cells. Here's all the evidence. Oh, wait, the evidence was destroyed by the Defense Department. How did that happen? What a coincidence. It's the same thing. The part of the building that was hit on 9/11, the part of the Pentagon that was hit, was the department responsible for the audit on which Donald Rumsfeld had talked about on September the 10th. There was billions of dollars missing out of the Pentagon budget that was not accounted for. Oh, wow, the accounting department gets hit. What a coincidence. What a strange coincidence. Super chat from $20. Much love and appreciation. Well, much love and appreciation for the super chat. Thank you. I think that might be the first super chat on one of these streams. So thank you very much. Bob Bayer is the 4th suspect that James Corbett brings up. Bob Bayer is on the record. We have a video of him saying that he knew somebody who went to his broker on September the 10th who said the phrase is, cash me out, it's going down tomorrow. And Corbett says, why haven't we asked Bob Baer what he was talking about, who this person was, who had knowledge that something was going down tomorrow, and that that he needed to be cashed out. If you don't know, Bob Baer is said to be the character, the person who the character, George Clooney's character in Syriana, was formed around some stories that Bob Baer had been involved in his time in intelligence. So that's a good film on its own. Maybe that's a discussion for a future film club. Syriana, that's a separate conversation. Ralph Eberhardt is the fifth suspect, and he was in charge of NORAD, and he presided over the worst failure of U.S. air, the biggest failure of the U.S. in regards to its airspace in history. So we had hijacked airplanes flying around for 109 minutes. And people will tell you all the time that you'll have a plane that will go off course near an airbase, and a plane will be up there within seconds. We're talking within 30, 50, 60 seconds. But for some reason, no planes. And he said on the record, NORAD didn't have any plan for this. We didn't have any notice for this, but we have evidence that NORAD did specifically do exercises in preparation for a major event happening in the United States. For example, they didn't necessarily say in this particular case for NORAD that it was the Pentagon, but we've seen printings of intelligence reports that showed the Twin Towers in crosshairs, because the idea would be you would hit some major American structure as a terrorist an attack. It could be Statue of Liberty, Washington Monument, whatever it might be. But the point was, the idea that he's saying NORAD had no plan, no notice, this flies in the face of the facts. And so his official testimony is a lie, but it's within the 9/11 Commission report, which Corbett always says the 9/11 Commission report is worth reading. And I think part of the challenge for me of why I've only read parts of it is because I know it's all a lie. And people like Corbett have gone through and documented, people like David Ray Griffin, other people have gone through the report and done a side-by-side and said, here's what this testimony says. Here's what the report says. Why is there a contradiction? 9/11 Contradictions. That's another fine book that goes through the 9/11 Commission report and asks questions about the gaps. Why are there gaps? So those are the five suspects that get us to the Dancing Israelis. So MF Doomer TV, you asked Dancing Israelis ? That's something that we covered 2 weeks ago, which was the last 20 minutes of this documentary. I just looked at it by itself because that's always such a big issue. We talked about it. We talked about the fact that it's really a distraction from the larger thing that happened after the Dancing Israeli story, which was a huge sweep up, a dragnet of Israeli spies in the United States. And the question of why are there Israeli spies in the United States? Why are there so many of them? Why were 60 of them captured in the days after 9/11? So that last 20 minutes sits within this whole documentary. So I think it's a nice overall capstone to what we're talking about. All right, let's look in the chat. Just considering that 9/11 provided the excuse to conduct pre-planned attacks on several countries says everything. Yeah, there's also a General Wesley Clark video that always circulates in which he was walking through somewhere. And keep in mind, so Clark, as a member of the military, has worked with different people, and then people transfer to different departments. And he's walking through, and someone says, General, can I talk to you? And he's told, hey, we're getting ready to go to Iraq. Why is that? I don't know. The intelligence has to be made to fit it. And there was already an idea behind going through and remaking the Middle East. We know about this from different white papers that were put out by all these people who live in the same world, like Philip Zelikow, Robert Crystal, these neocons who only see the world through one lens, which is America must be in charge forever. And in a certain sense, that means the rest of the world has to have America's boot on its neck or on its face. I guess neck if you're a friend, face if you're an enemy, forever. And that is how it's always going to be. Ignoring that this is ahistorical, no empire lasts forever, and that this doesn't bring love and peace into the world. And I'm not so silly as to think that, any empire has ever sought to bring love and peace into the world, any worldly empire. But I'm simply pointing out that their answer to everything is death. Their answer to everything is destruction. When you only hold a hammer in your hand, every problem looks like a nail. And that's what the neocons think. They want to bring America into every conflict that matters to them. Where the conflict doesn't matter to them, that means these people don't have minerals, they don't have things that we could use, they don't have valuable geography, then who cares about them? Then they can die. We're not worried about them. But if these people are involved in any parts of the world in which we could benefit, witness Lindsey Graham on television recently saying Ukraine has many billions of valuable minerals. We don't want Russia to get that. We want to get that. Same thing, Lindsey Graham saying, hey, this International Criminal Court, we've got to stop them or otherwise they'd be coming for us next. And then people in the audience clap. And he's like, oh, you can clap if you want to. Lindsey Graham's going to be in for a very special particular judgment at his death. Tomas, when you know how the United Fruit colluded with government and how they lied about their activities and how a lot of the personnel were involved in Middle East conflicts, do you then understand? Yeah, Tomas, great point. And I've referenced this book numerous times, not just in this stream, but in other videos. Bananas is the name of the book. It's not back here on my all-time. I think I've loaned it to somebody recently. How the United Fruit Company colluded, particularly Honduras. That's very helpful. If you want to go back further, there's Smedley Butler, who writes about this in a very small volume about war as a racket, and that he, the most decorated U.S. military man at the time of his death, he was a Medal of Honor recipient, a U.S. Marine Corps general, who had been proposed by a shadowy cabal in the United States to overthrow the president. And they didn't realize they were dealing with a real patriot, somebody who really cared about his country and had started to wake up to what he was being used as, which was an errand boy for big banks. And Smedley Butler also identifies so you can tie Smedley Butler to United Fruit and that book Bananas, and any other situations in which you can see that the idea of America as the democracy, the beacon of democracy, freedom, peace, etc. This is always what's put forward. It's what I was taught since I was a child. But it's not only not true, but it's the opposite. It's the exact opposite of the reality. Typical U.S. excuses to start wars. Yeah, you have stuff I want. That's a reason. That's a reason to start a war. Tomas, neocons. So Tomas, if you're unfamiliar with this, and maybe you are, and you're just asking a different question, but in case anyone in the chat or watching is unfamiliar, the neoconservative movement, these are effectively just Trotskyites who redefine themselves post-Reagan and became very attached to the idea of the national security state, particularly the defense of Israel, and that U.S. foreign policy, in a sense, could be defined by Israel. And so you'll see a lot of their policy papers related to that, the sort of stuff you'd find coming out of think tanks on J Street. The United Slaves of AIPAC. I think that's pretty valid. So any other comments from anybody on the 9/11 Suspects documentary? If you had a chance to watch it, let me know your thoughts. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, I hope that I persuaded you to give it a shot. It's not very long. I want to say something like an hour and 20 minutes in total, but well worth your time. And you won't find it on YouTube. Maybe if you really dig, and maybe it's called something else, but you'll find lots of copies of it on Odyssey. And that's where I put the link for it in the original description. Tracy, you're lurking. I just exposed your lurking, but thank you for stopping by. Have you seen any research from Christopher Ballin on this cruise? I have not. If you have links that you'd like to share, you can put them in the chat, and I can share them later. The name sounds vaguely familiar, though. Maybe I have, and I just don't recognize the name. But there are so many questions about 9/11, and in fact, you could do an hour live stream on pretty much every aspect of it. All throughout the different sites that were happening, what happened at the Pentagon, what happened at WTC-1, what happened at WCT-2, what was happening in the buildings, people talking about explosions. How could there be explosions at the lower levels if you're talking about the fact that fire brought down the buildings? What are all the explosions that are coming out? And we can see from the video as the building's collapsing. We've talked about previously, what are the cell phone calls doing? In 2001, you're telling me that people are making cell phone calls at 30,000 feet. We can't do that in 2024. You can't make cell phone calls at 30,000 feet. So how could you possibly have been doing it in 2001? One of the people calling his mom and introducing himself by his first name and his last name. I mean, it's just, there's so many questions, but I always talk about Building 7. Building 7 is something I always refer back to. And I feel like more and more people know about Building 7. I think if we go back 10 years ago, it would have raised a lot more eyebrows, but I think more and more people have heard about Building 7. And actually, there's a good documentary, which we might cover for Film Club in the next couple of weeks, about Building 7. But that's always a starting point for me. And I've said this, and I'll say it again. If that building came down without a plane hitting it and it collapsed into its own footprint, why? And you have to have an explanation for that. And not that many years ago, we had a building in London that was on fire for hours and hours and hours, just burning. Lots of people died, unfortunately. The building did not collapse. We don't see anything like that level of fire in Building 7. Firefighters are told it's going to collapse. Larry Silverstein talks about pulling the building. We decided to pull it, and the building collapsed. So the building was demolished. If Building 7 could have been rigged for demolition, why couldn't WTC 1 and 2 have been rigged for demolition? It's a simple question. It's just a simple possibility. The idea is that's impossible. It rules out Building 7. So that's why I always circle back to it. Please talk about Building 7. And over the years, I just think there's been more openness to discuss it. Whereas before it was just, you're a conspiracy theorist and, do you hate America, et cetera. And that's always the way that people try to end arguments emotionally. Cruz, have you seen exactly what hit the Pentagon? I mean, Cruz, I don't know that anyone has actually seen what hit the Pentagon, because all we have are these frames. There's a bunch of videos that have not been released. I think Loose Change covered this years ago. There's a bunch of other videos that have never been released for national security reasons. But all we have is a few frames. Who knows what hit? It certainly wasn't a plane, whatever it was. The idea that a passenger airliner could penetrate all the way in. There's 5 rings, A, B, C, D, E rings of the Pentagon. And this idea that this plane with a soft nose is going to penetrate all the way in. Maybe a missile could, or something else, or there could have been an explosion in the building. But the idea that all that's left is some like part of a fuselage, this thing just sort of disintegrated. That's more cosplay. I mean, in a sense, Pentagon is even more cosplay than Building 7. But as I say, you could do a separate stream about each of these. I want to stay focused on today's 9/11 suspects. There's always time to do more streams on these other subjects. But there's more questions. I always tell people the truth is not afraid of questions. Truth is always open to questions because it's there to be investigated. Jaffa Cake, have you watched Michael? I did watch it. I don't remember it being very good. Like, if you've watched any Michael Moore documentaries, and I've seen probably 5 or 6 of them, you come away with some helpful factoids. I thought one of his early ones that he did about Flint, Michigan, about the water problem there, I thought was very good. But the rest of his stuff and the way he edits is dishonest. What I always come away with is a couple interesting facts, but no real coherent argument from him. And I don't remember Fahrenheit 9/11 being a really helpful contribution. Otherwise, I think I would remember and say, yes, you know what Moore said in Fahrenheit 9/11. I think it was just pandering to the left about it. I don't think Moore has ever really backed a serious investigation of 9/11. And that tells you exactly where he stands. America probably peaked in 1955. Thomas, I think that's a bit generous. I'm one of these people. I would probably say 1820. Tomas, Michael Moore obfuscates. Don't watch his content. I think that's a fair point, Tomas. I do think it's important to watch what enemies do. I think if you are trying to argue against somebody, you need to have at least read or seen some of their stuff in order to do that. It's not for everybody to do that, but I would argue I think that's important. All right. I've got about 5 minutes before I'm heading over to Palestine Bookshelf. The book, the film club that we're doing over there is on the settlers, and I have to say one of the best documentaries I've seen on the Palestinian issue so far, and the first one I've really seen that goes deeply into the issue of the settlements. I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to sharing that with whoever comes on the stream. So that's on Palestine Bookshelf in 5 minutes, and would love to welcome you over there. Obviously, that's a newer channel, still growing, kind of working our way up towards monetization. Whereas this is the sort of dad channel that's been around a little longer. So I really appreciate everybody coming on the stream. Lots of people on actually today relative to last one, which I was talking about, a passage to India. I just have to be honest with myself and with our audience that English literature live stream, not that many people interested. 9/11, lots of people interested. And that's okay. I'm not doing this necessarily to only talk about the things that lots of people are interested in. I'm also doing it for things that interest me. Otherwise, there's no joy, there's no passion in being able to do something like this, which is a fun side project. I have work, I have other pursuits, I have other projects that take up my time. This is something that I love to share, and I'm just glad for people to come on whatever subject I end up covering. Has some nice compliments from Tomas and Alex in the chat. Thank you very much, guys. All right. So if there's no other further comments, I will let you all go. And as I say, I got to head over and prep for Palestine Bookshelf's live stream, which is now going to be in 3 minutes. Thank you all for coming. And if you have information to share, as always, put them in the comments so that other people can learn and that I can learn. And I'm always open to hearing more about not just 9/11, but anything. Thanks for coming, everybody.